So let me get this straight. Instead of talking about books I haven't read, I'm going to be talking about books that haven't been written. Hello, I'm Tim and I have too many books. I'm going to do the books never written tag. This is put together by Grix, etc. This is about books that were never written and about books that you wish had been. And I've got a few to talk about. We start with Flashman and the American Tiff by George Macdonald Fraser. The great missing book from George Macdonald Fraser's Flashman stories is of course Flashman and the Civil War, and this would be the book about Flashman and the Civil War. I've just given it a rather silly title. George Macdonald Fraser was often asked about when he was going to write this book and would often put people off, making excuses. In fact, in a queue to get his autograph, I once heard him saying to the person in front of me that he'd probably written all he was ever going to write about Flashman and the Civil War. What we know of Flashman and the American Civil War is that Flashman served as an advisor to both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, and as aide-de-camp to both General Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. Personally, I think the problem for George Macdonald Fraser was that he couldn't really come up with a really great skeleton story which would allow him to bounce Flashman like a pinball around all the different people he could. Also, the American Civil War is so well documented that we virtually know what Lincoln, Davis, Grant and Lee were doing on an hour-by-hour basis, and it's very difficult to slip Flashman into the interstices of those timings. The next book is Jane, a Sister's Portrait by Cassandra Austen. Now, nobody knew more about Jane Austen than Cassandra Austen, and we're never going to get memoirs by Jane Austen. She was very reticent about talking about herself. In fact, she asked her sister Cassandra to destroy many of her letters before she died. In the book Miss Austen by Jill Hornby, we see Cassandra Austen in later life uncovering a cache of Jane Austen's letters belonging to somebody else and secretly destroying them. So we were never going to get this book from Cassandra Austen. We're never going to get a biography. We get a sanitised biography of Jane Austen by her nephew, but we don't get the real thing from Cassandra, the person who knew all of Jane Austen's secrets, who shared her life in so many ways. If only Cassandra Austen had disobeyed her sister's command and kept the letters and written a biography, we would have an absolutely fascinating portrait of the real Jane Austen, something that we Jane Austen fans would love to see. But of course, you know, it's going against Jane Austen's wishes. So we are asking Cassandra Austen to be rather like Max Brod was for Franz Kafka. Franz Kafka asked Max Brod to destroy all his writings. Instead, Max Brod decided, no, these deserve to be seen by the world. And I think the world is fairly grateful for that, even if Kafka would have been absolutely horrified. And I think Jane Austen would have been horrified if Cassandra Austen had written A Sister's Portrait. The next book is Monstrous Regiment of Women, My Secret Life by James Barrie. On the face of it, James Barrie's life is fairly interesting on its own. He trained as a surgeon during the Napoleonic Wars and joined the army, rising through the ranks until he became an Inspector General. This is the equivalent of a colonel, but one of the most senior medical officers in the British Army. And in the Crimean War, he was in charge of hospital hygiene and came into conflict with Florence Nightingale. The thing about James Barrie, of course, is that after his death, it became common knowledge that he had been born a woman, and her probable name was Margaret Ann Bulkeley. But the thing is, that's all we've got. Even though the fact that James Barrie was a woman is generally accepted, it's based on some fairly flimsy evidence. And we don't really know anything about James Barrie, anything about what was going through her head. Now, I generally accept that she was a woman based on the evidence, although it is skeletal, it is fragmentary. All the biographies that have ever been written about James Barrie are based on very, very little evidence. It's based on hearsay, it is based on speculation and almost fantasy. So to have James Barrie's words saying, no, This is who I am. This is what I did. And I was that part of that monstrous regiment of women. The next book is Tyrant, The Life of King George III by Phernow. Yeah, well, I can't use his real name. Ask any American what they thought of King George III. They're going to say, well, King George, he was a tyrant, you know. This is a little bit confusing for people in Britain who think, well, he's Farmer George, and he's the king who went mad after losing the colonies. You could make the argument that there isn't a rational definition of the word tyrant that actually fits George III. Now, the thing is, a decade or so ago, every single extant piece of George III's writing was released into the National Archives in Britain. Which means that any researcher can go through this trove of documents and, well, basically convict him in his own words. If he's a tyrant, it will be in his writing, won't it? But for this past decade, only one biography has been written of George III. It's by Andrew Roberts, and it is rather complimentary towards George III. Andrew Roberts lets him off. He goes through the indictments against George III in the Declaration of Independence and crosses them all out, saying, no, these don't apply, these don't apply. George III had nothing to do with this, in many cases. So the only detailed biography we have of him is a little bit too on his side. Definitely doesn't paint him as a tyrant. The question for me is, where is the authoritative American biography of George III? He is the original gangster villain of the American story. And there is barely a detailed biography of him available even before all this documentation was brought out. Now, I can make up reasons for this. After all, no historian wants to put in their first paragraph of a biography of George III, everything you think you know about George III is probably wrong. And no American publisher is going to want to publish a book that says, oh, by the way, you've been lied to for 250 years about this man. I don't think that's going to happen. But I definitely think that you should ask Lon Phernow or even Ron Chernow next time you see them why they haven't written their authoritative biography of George III. They have all the evidence. They can convict him in his own words. But we hear only silence. Maybe the truth isn't that he's a tyrant. Maybe the truth is closer to the hagiography of Andrew Roberts. The next book is Salmon of Doubt by Douglas Adams. Now, this book actually exists, and you probably have a copy of it, or at least you should have a copy of it. But this isn't the book that Douglas Adams was going to write. After he died tragically young in 2001 at the age of about 49, and it's horrible to think that I'm almost 10 years older than him, they put together essays, articles, and interviews and some unpublished writings into a book which they called Salmon of Doubt. That was going to be his next novel. It started out life as the third Dirk Gently novel, carrying on the story of Dirk Gently and featuring his character from Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul, Kate Schechter. And then it was going to become the sixth Hitchhiker's book. Douglas Adams was very aware that Mostly Harmless was a rather depressing ending to the Hitchhiker's saga, and he wanted to correct that. Mostly Harmless had been written at a very difficult period for him, both personally and financially. He had to sell his house in order to buy back the film rights to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And when he died, he was working on the script for the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy film. The last book is K.O.G.V.O.S by Jimmy Grafton. Jimmy Grafton was my grandfather, and K.O.G.V.O.S would be the memoirs that we believe he was writing, or beginning to write, shortly before his death at a relatively young age of 70. A brief history of my grandfather. He was the fourth in a line of James Graftons, who owned a pub in Strutton Ground, Westminster. It was called Grafton's. And people in the Grafton family are very strict about it being called Grafton's. During the Second World War, he served in a number of units, including the 4th Dorset, and was at Arnhem when they crossed the river to link up with the beleaguered Airborne Brigade on the other side of the Rhine. He didn't, on this occasion or on any other occasion, win the Military Cross, which it says in his Wikipedia page. After the war, he became a radio comedy scriptwriter. He was fairly successful. I mean, not massively successful. He's not some great comedy genius. And I don't think he was ever particularly precious about his comedy writing. But he was certainly good enough to tell a good joke and good enough to write comedy series and comedy variety shows right throughout the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. In the late 40s, being somebody who wrote radio comedy and also owned a pub, he became a rather popular figure. And a lot of comedians who later became very famous gravitated towards Grafton's in Stratton Ground. 4 of these comedians were Michael Benteen, Harry Seacombe, Spike Milligan and Peter Sellers. In the pub they formed a comedy group who later became those crazy people, the Goons. Michael Benteen left after the first couple of radio series that they made in the late 40s and early 50s, but the Goons went on to great fame throughout the 1950s. My grandfather was associated with the Goons throughout most of their history, and he became known as KOGVOS, the Keeper of Goons and Voice of Sanity. In addition to being nicknamed K.O.G.V.O.S, the pub which he ran, as I said, Grafton's, was nicknamed the Grafton Arms, and unfortunately for the Grafton family, that is a name that has stuck rather too well. And when he died, many people came forward saying that he was pivotal in their careers and in their success. Not because he had given them the big breaks, but because he'd said, oh, you need to speak to this person, and fixed up a meeting, given sage advice. He gave very good advice, I know, to my cost, because, yeah, he saw right through me.